Good morning. I'm so glad to see those of you that are here, and we're expecting more people, so we're excited about that. This is our coffee chat on tracking language goals, and we have our EL program specialist, Mary, to guide us through that. For those of you who don't know, we're the Diverse Learners Cooperative and a nonprofit based out of Nashville. And we are on a mission to connect teachers and leaders with professional learning resources and networks that improve outcomes for diverse learners and increase teacher and leader retention. As we know, that's a primary barrier for our students with disabilities and multilingual learners to have really great teachers who stay with them. So that is what we are doing with these coffee chats on Fridays, 15 minutes of learning, a strategy that you can take and use next week in your classrooms, virtual classrooms or otherwise. And so we are excited about tracking language goals this morning. So I'll let Mary take it away from there.
Yes, today we're talking about tracking our progress towards language goals. How do we do that? And so our mission is just to discuss strategies for creating and tracking language goals for our multilingual learners so that we ensure we're teaching them in the most effective ways possible. So we'll go through some of the challenges first. We'll look at a process for doing this, some examples, talk about staying organized, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments and hear from you guys. So if we're thinking about this, there's a lot of challenges and limitations that come with it. Some of the challenges we hear are, I'm not sure what data to track, or it's hard to make time. I'm not sure if my students are making progress. And then we also currently have specific limitations due to being virtual. FaceTime with students, building rapport, access to technology and internet access or lack of caregiver support during assessments, during trying to figure out this information. And also the reliability and usability of virtually collected data is it is a challenge or a limitation. So we have this quote, if you define the problem correctly, you almost have the solution. So we're identifying these challenges and these limitations to look at what could be the solution to this problem. So I've got a process for you that you can go through to create and track some specific language goals for your multilingual learners, keeping in mind that we have those challenges and limitations on our plates. Our first step would be to analyze their access scores. Then you're going to decide on reasonable year-end goals. We're going to match those with performance definitions and create formative assessments based on measurable language objectives. And then we'll reflect on progress at regular intervals and adjust our instruction. That's the key piece, right? To see the change. So let's jump right in. The first step is analyzing your access scores. So access scores are great, but they don't always give us a full picture. When we put together the composite access scores with their individual domain scores, like what is their score in reading or listening or writing, or what's their comprehension score, plus putting together with what we know about students already, all of those pieces need to come together to give us a full picture of what our access scores mean for our students. When we just look at a 3.2 or a 4.8, that doesn't always give us the full picture, and having everything that we know about our students put together is going to give us a better understanding of where they're starting. Our next step is to think about a target goal. So this is just an example. We're in Tennessee, and Tennessee uses this growth standard for tracking progress for EL students. And on the left, you have the prior score range. It's what the students came in with, what their score was the previous year. And then the growth standard on the right is what we're expecting students to grow in a year. That is the number of points that we're hoping that they're growing. So I've got two examples here just to help us understand it. Student A, down at the bottom, his composite last year was a 3.4. So his growth standard, if you look across from a 3.4, it says 0.4. So that's what we're expecting him to do this year. And we want his year-end composite score to be a 3.8. So that gives us a good target for where he's going to end up at the end of the year. That's what a year's growth that's reasonable to be expected for him. For student B, she came in at a 1.3. And we know with newer language learners that they can grow much more rapidly at the beginning. So her growth standard is 1.3 levels. So when we put those together, we're looking at the end of the year, her expected composite should be a 2.6. From there, now we have some year-end goals. We know where they started, we know where we want them to go. So now we got to figure out where to put them together and what to do with those numbers. So their accessors, they're a great starting point. They just don't show the growth that we want. So instead, we're going to use those as a starting point for their goals with the WIDA performance definitions as our guide. So I'm going to take you through an example. So with student A that we looked at before, their composite at the beginning of the year was 3.4. We want them to grow 0.4. And at the end of the year, we want them to be a 3.8. So we're going to look at the performance definitions. And this is a 2-page document, if you're not familiar with it, from WIDA that I love for a reference for educators to keep near them when they're thinking about their students. It breaks down complex language into 3 different parts: academic language in discourse, which is like their overall understanding of the language that you're talking about, the sentence level, and then at the word level, which is often what we're thinking about vocabulary. So we have 3 different levels, and we have all of their scores, whatever their score would be. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but a level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, it goes up on the left side here based on what their score is. And so I highlighted where this student would be. We want them at the end of the year to be close to, if they're at 3.8, we want them to be close to this level 4, this expanding. So we're going to use that as our target. So I summarized what we want this student to do when they're speaking and writing over here. Based on that level 4 goal, we want to see this student moving towards producing language with a variety of sentence types, with organized expressions of ideas, compound and complex grammatical structures, using content-specific language and structure, and using idioms. Those are just some examples. So that really helps us understand what is a great expectation for language for the student when they're producing language. We're going to also look at our other student when we're thinking about listening and reading. This is the other page of the rubric. For this student, they're a 1.3. We want them to be at a 2.6 by the end of the year. So I highlighted the level 2 and the level 3 because they're going to be kind of right in between there. In some pieces, they're going to be moving closer to a 3. In some pieces, they're going to be closer to a 2. But overall, when we see this student moving towards processing language, so taking language in through listening and through reading, we want to see them using multiple related simple sentences with a few complex ones. We want to see repetitive phrases that's across content areas that's appropriate for them. They're going to be able to understand and process some content-specific language and expressions. And then they're also going to be thinking about social language and multiple ideas that have details. Just one idea with details at a level 2, and then multiple ideas after that. So we're gradually pushing them towards these year-end goals. Now, but we have some expectations of where we want them to end up. We've got to figure out how are we going to get them there through the middle of the year? What are we going to do as we're going? So this quote says, keeping track of students' developing language can occur simultaneously with tracking their developing content knowledge. There's no need to create new assignments to obtain samples of student language. I think this quote can be really challenging for some educators because it can often be overwhelming thinking about how are we going to test their language? What assessment can I use to progress monitor them? And what it's saying here, and what I'm going to suggest to you, is that we can actually embed these language expectations and this progress monitoring within our content development of students. The way we're going to do that is through formative assessment. We know that the goal of formative assessment is to provide continual feedback to a teacher about student progress towards mastery of the content, which just means that we're going to use our language objectives to progress monitor formative assessment in our students. So the first thing that we would do is when we're thinking about a lesson that we have, we're going to ask, how are students using language domains in this lesson? Are they listening? How are they speaking? Are they reading? Are they writing? We're going to go from there, refer back to our performance definitions to appropriately set expectations for them around language usage. And then we're going to write measurable language objectives that work alongside the content objectives. I'm going to show you an example next. we know that these are some stems that you can use for your language objectives. And when you're teaching virtually, you can use them all the time. Writing them on lessons, adding them to student work, putting them in the chat box, asking students to read them. These stems help give an idea of what you can do when you're writing your language objective, but I'm going to show you an example next. So if this is a language lesson and it's synchronous, so you're live with students, and the domain here that we're focusing on is writing. This one's going to be a standard time every week. We want a language objective during a regular class lesson, and we're going to coordinate those expectations with the students. And what we would do is we would write a measurable language objective first. So that's over here on the right. So in this one, it's students will write a paragraph detailing the process of the scientific experiment. We're going to connect that with the language objectives to the performance definitions. So it would be students will write a 4+ sentence paragraph using a variety of sentence structures, detailing the process of scientific experiment using specific content vocabulary. So I can take this measurable language objective and match it to the work that the student produces in that lesson. I put these side by side and it gives me a chance to evaluate their language goals. I've set a reasonable expectation for them through the content that we're already teaching, and I know that it's connected and aligned to what they can do in the performance definitions. And I'm going to show you in a minute how to organize the information and where you want to keep it. Another example for speaking, this is an asynchronous lesson, and the language objective was that students will speak about how they solve the mathematical task in a Flipgrid video. When we connect that with the performance definitions, it could be that students will speak in 4 or more complete connected sentences about how they solve the mathematical task using specific math vocabulary and visual examples in a Flipgrid video. Right here, I have a rubric now in which to compare the product that they're giving me to the expectations that I know are appropriate for them. Once I have that information, the key now is to reflect on what they did, see if they're meeting their expectations, their language goals, and then adjust my instruction based on that information. So we want to take time to use the data that we gained from their work on their formative assessments and their language objectives. So we want to know, were they successful? Where do they need to continue to grow? Was it effective in measuring the students' abilities? What's going well? What can we do better? And then what's the next best step? That's one of our favorite questions at the DLC. Next best step for them. Maybe I need to work on those complex sentences. Maybe they had a misunderstanding from the vocabulary. Maybe the content specific discussion was kind of going over their head. So I need to give them more support so that they can access that. All of this information is going to help me instruct them more appropriately, give them better supports, and help me make sure that I'm pushing them towards their year-end goal. We want to stay organized with this information. So one of my favorite ways to do that is to keep a student portfolio. Now that we're virtual, we can also do that in a virtual way. So I have linked on here that you'll get in this presentation a slide deck that you can use in this example. The first 2 slides are student information, current levels, goals, context about the student, and then the subsequent slides, you would put screenshots or sound bites or videos of student work with the domain, the date, the subject, and any context. And then you can keep track of how students are growing as they continue through this process throughout the year. You can frequently review the portfolio with the performance definitions and your expectations for them for their year-end goals and consider how they're progressing. Then you adjust your instruction and your support accordingly. This is so great because you can share it with all of their teachers, you can share it with the student, and it gives you a fantastic picture of what it looks like throughout the whole year. So that is our ideas about how we can track language goals for our students. I would love to hear from you next about how you're doing this and some other ways that you're keeping your data organized. If you'd like to join us next week, before we go into our Q&A, I'm just going to plug that next week we'll have Josh and Mary, and they're going to be talking about co-planning practices for all teachers. So I think you'll find it really useful.